Hello, welcome to episode 2 of scrolling through my bookmarks. I put them in a folder specifically for the show, so it would be a little bit less random. So that'll either make it more organized or take away a little bit of the magic. So let's find out which way it goes. All right, looks like we're starting off with a hot topic. What was this in reference to? Let me max the screen here for a second. Okay, so Piers Morgan is saying shameful abuse of power for someone to be pardoned during a criminal trial, etc. This is, it's it's funny to see. It's a classic virtue signal because I don't really think Piers cares about this or has strong values of civic process that are being offended at. It's purely opportunistic and narrative driven, and it's what do you call it? It's childish because obviously one of the huge lever points for ending the war in Gaza and ending the war in Iran was making sure that Netanyahu would get pardoned, because as everyone talked about, all the anti-war people forever talked about, was that Netanyahu we're going to go into a war with Iran because Netanyahu needs wars to continue. So they're going to expand throughout Syria and they're going to do greater Israel. And they just have to keep the war going forever and ever and ever, because if the state of emergency ends, then Netanyahu is going to get arrested as a war criminal. So he has to keep it going. So Trump's like, oh, okay, great. Well, let's make sure that he's pardoned so that we can get him to agree to wrap this war up rather than going down burning with the ship. I mean, it's this. I mean, we made the same offer to Maduro in Venezuela. We would let him, leave or not get killed by his own population, even though like Israel's an ally and Venezuela is not. It's just math, right? If you hate Maduro, like, do you hate Maduro more, or do you care more about the people of Venezuela? Like, even if you're Maduro's domestic enemy, you should be like, yeah, don't back him into a corner, let him out of the room. It would be like if you had a wasp in your house and you refused to open the windows because that's cowardice or something, and you have to stop him with your hands. Like, no tools, no open windows, just it's complete buffoonery. And I guess my lingo here was strong, because if you really care about the situation in Palestine and preventing forever wars in the Middle East, then you should be totally on board with Netanyahu getting his pardon. And it brings up some interesting questions about that. I know maybe it's my outdated sense of honor, but if you make an agreement, then you follow through, even if it's with someone you consider to have done crimes or been a bad guy. It's like, if you make that deal as a condition, then just let them get pardoned. It's not about, there's the factor of eroding your trust internationally as a country. There's plenty of other things we do to do that. It just doesn't occur to me to make a deal, even if you're not happy about it, and not follow through on the other side. So I want the wars to end. I want no war with Iran, and I'm totally fine with Netanyahu being pardoned as a byproduct of that. And I think it's a little hypocritical to not be, especially if you're one of the leading voices talking about the suffering of Palestinians. Okay, this is a pretty funny one. I don't know if everyone will get the context for this, but basically regulation was a topic that Cato focused on forever because they were in this beltway zone where they didn't want to talk about anything too radical or disruptive like the Federal Reserve. And now the Federal Reserve is being popularized as an issue. So if you try and say that regulations are more important, it kind of looks to people as if you're trying to avoid talking about the hard subject of the Federal Reserve, which is more controversial, considered more controversial as a topic. I mean, not that long ago, basically nobody even knew what the cause of inflation was, or at least it wasn't part of the political discourse. So when I'm talking to people about this, I swear I'm not trying to trick them to avoid being radical about the Fed. Deregulation is actually important. It represents a huge opportunity gap. Not only that, but it's politically feasible, both at a federal level and at a local level. You can't get rid of the Federal Reserve from the state level office, but especially with Chevron, you can push your regulation policy all the way to the limit. You could set up a totally free economy in the U.S. If you had control at the state level, especially considering Trump and all of his decentralization efforts relative to the regulatory framework. His executive orders saying any regulation that violates the 10th Amendment is not going to stand up in court. That basically gives states huge room to push on that area. You can't do that with the Fed. The other thing is, obviously, we're dependent on the Fed. Not many countries are able to pass off half their inflation onto global dollar holders. I mean, no countries are. And a huge percent of our spending burden is paid for through that spending. So and you can't even legislatively attack the Fed. It's completely protected institution. So the way you start chipping away at the Fed is you remove capital gains tax on competing currencies. That could force some Fed discipline while creating an alternate option. But you can't just pull out the Fed as a piece from the system. Regulation, on the other hand, you can pull out. There's very little dependency built around regulation. It's pretty much all upside and political gravy. The only losers are the corporate economic cartels. Unlike spending, that affects a much wider variety of people. The area regulation gets more complicated in is where it's not the pure corporate regulatory capture, which allows certain corporations to scale, but it's the service level industry capture where you have all the doctors or certain licensed medical professionals that paid a certain amount for school, and they need the salaries of their profession to be high enough to pay off their school by a certain point as was planned. And these medical schools are really expensive, and often, like, even as a nurse, you can not pay off your debt till you're like 50 years old or older. So if the salaries go down, but they paid all this money for school, then they're never going to be able to pay it off. So once they made it through the barriers, it's like a lawyer that takes the bar exam isn't going to want to loosen the restrictions for the rest of the industry. And so that's a fairly dispersed interest group in all those professions that relates a little bit more to spending, which a lot of people get that money, right? So it affects a lot of people, but there's a lot of regulations that basically only prop up Pfizer or Walmart, or name your big corporation, and that is complete political gravy if you can get past the special interests. So it's not a trick. It's a real political opportunity. And I was laughing because a year ago I saw Zoran's ad about the licensing on the carts. So, which it was a kind of a deregulatory populist economic point. And I had this thought, which was, we got to watch out, because if the left figures out deregulation while we're ignoring it, then they can get a huge amount of political wins off of that. And I've talked forever about how the reason Sweden became so successful was a tradition of really free markets in the early part of the 20th century. They expanded socialism pretty aggressively in the 70s. And the only thing that turned that around was they did a kind of a massive deregulation effort in the late 90s and early 2000s. And so that's what got them in the position to be used as an example of successful socialism, because regulation makes such a big negative impact that you actually can score huge political points and make it look like socialism works for a little bit longer. Like if Mondani deregulated not only food carts and not only bodegas but other small businesses, and then construction or real estate, which is something he was speaking to Trump about recently, while business as usual rules in the other areas, then his only impact is going to be seen as positive. And so if we don't take ownership of the regulatory issue, it's a real potential weakness, because whoever wins on this issue basically is going to win. And it's absurd to think the left will do it, because they're so full of it on this issue. You heard Newsom, even Gavin Newsom was talking about red tape. So, nobody believes that he's very sincere on the topic. But they're still using it as a talking point more and more. Ezra Klein is talking about it a lot. I often say that the left realized that they had a real weakness on this issue when Elon Musk and Trump were campaigning around Doge and talking about red tape. And so they started forming these defensive narrative responses for a punch that never came from the rest of the right. Because, I don't know, we didn't jump on this issue. We're just talking about Israel and the Fed and whatever else people talk about. So at least Trump is focused on the issue. And it's funny to see him working with Trump on this issue now, because it's one step closer to my insane theory about the left being able to score points on this issue, kind of getting closer to reality. So watch out about that. All right. Okay. So that now I'm in the comments of that. So we're going back to our bookmark scroll. Okay. Yeah. And here's another example of why regulations are so important. If you look at the prices of healthcare, the artificial inflated nature of them is completely tied to regulation. Like, why do we only have one medical association in America? Why is the American Medical Association a monopoly that controls licensing standards, industry standards through the state boards for the entire country? We need competing ways of doing things. It's complete insanity, and people's lives are being destroyed. People are opting entirely out of the medical system because it's either too expensive to get insurance, or the medical system is, depending on what illness you have, there's a 50-50 chance it's going to kill you, because they're just advancing industry captured solutions basically in the same way that satellite radio will only play songs that has studio owned IP, doctors will only recommend medicines that have industry owned IP or strong IP, which they can make a lot of money off of. And the doctors don't question a lot of times because it's easier to outsource your sense of responsibility or guilt onto these institutions that are supposed to be the real experts and have more time to look into all these issues than you. And maybe you haven't been to medical school in a while, or maybe you didn't even cover that in medical school. But it's the doctor's responsibility to be the leaders in the industry. Like you are the experts. And if you have someone taking control of a single institution, and then they're able to puppet master the voice of every local trusted doctor in America, then you have a mechanism for system-wide capture. And that's not trusting your doctor. That's trusting the AMA, and your doctor is a hollow shell. It's doctors' responsibility to be leading the way on these issues and to actually think about their practice instead of following a script. But they're limited in their ability to do that, because if you deviate, then you can lose your license or lose your connection to insurance, which is a big thing during COVID. If medical establishments didn't make their staff get the shot, I had a friend who runs a chiro shop, and if he didn't have his staff take the shot, then they would have not been able to collect insurance. So it's a huge issue that's just killing millions of people a year. And with some basic deregulation, we could cut prices in half for a lot of these drugs. And it's great Trump is doing his moves with insurance. He's talking about paying the people directly instead of the insurance companies. This is basically exactly the medical equivalent of school choice, where you're taking the money for public schools and just giving it directly to the parents instead. That way they can choose other options. The issue with that is if the regulatory landscape isn't disrupted enough, then you're still going to have very few options to use your dollars on. But at least it will accelerate the collapse of the health insurance system to alternate providers, because those options do exist, especially post-COVID. They've become a lot more organized, a lot more numerous. The main issue with these alternate forms of mutual aid kind of, or direct subscription services to doctors, all these different kind of plans, the main limit is that you're not actually allowed to do things that differently, and you kind of get funneled back into the hospital system for a lot of treatments. But the money is going directly to the people as a big step, because with school choice, if you have more people going to private school, then suddenly there's a larger lobby for, hey, why are these alternate options so heavily regulated? Most people don't even know how regulated private school is. And in most states, it's regulated to the point where you're not actually creating that different of an education model than the public school. And the private schools are often regulated more strictly according to the blanket standards, where like the public schools won't get an audit and the private schools are very aggressively held to the regulations. So we really need to get rid of the regulations both in education and in healthcare, and that will drastically accelerate the number of options that people have to use their own dollars on, which will just drain the system. All right, what do we got here? Oh, yes. an early clip of Fuentes and Spencer, which is hilarious. I don't know how many of you were into politics when Richard Spencer was around the first time, but he was never accepted on the right because his National Socialism was too on the nose. He was basically taking the myth that, I was just talking about how Sweden and how socialism doesn't work there. The only reason people thought it worked was because of deregulation, and they have similar levels of spending and taxes as the US. And they also do broad-based tax collection in Scandinavia, which is what you need to do to pay for high public spending while avoiding capital flight. So there's this myth that Scandinavia is working. Bernie Sanders points to it all the time as the example of socialism, right? We want Scandinavia. We don't want Venezuela. Then conservatives countered that by saying Sweden only works because it's homogeneous. And then so you have Richard Spencer popping up saying, yeah, Sweden does work because it's homogeneous and it's not about the socialism. And so I want to be like Sweden. And he advances his national socialism off of that framework. But what conservatives really should have done was have a better answer to quote unquote why socialism works in Sweden, and the answer would have been that socialism doesn't work. They're actually very similar to the US, and their advantages on the regulatory front. So we could have pointed all of that out, but our only way to argue with Bernie Sanders was homogeneity, which matters, but that's also related to socialism, because the socialism is what's making people dependent on these social security traps, which is incentivizing immigration. It's creating these skills gaps in the labor force, and it's forcing people to I mean there's a ton, like, socialism is directly connected to immigration because it's hollowed out our societies to the point where we're importing people because we don't have our own domestic birth rate because we've killed it with bureaucracy. So it's all related in a funny way. So then the left tried to prop up Spencer as the ideal straw man, but his National Socialist messaging was too on the nose. Nick was much more careful about identifying himself as a socialist, but Nick just kind of generally takes the general views of his generation, minus a couple of the ones he's kind of trying to spearhead. In general, he'll morph to the polling of his generation, and his generation, as we've seen recently, is fairly socialist at a high degree. It's the most socialist generation in the country. And that can change fast. For example, in Argentina, Milei has like 77% youth support because his market-based reforms are viewed as the legitimate populism. But in the US, there's still a large contingent of kind of like shoe on head economics, as she calls it, which is basically normie views implanted through the public school on economics combined with a harder stance on immigration. And it's an issue because we need to solve immigration, but if we don't actually solve the socialism problem, then we're not going to thrive ourselves. We're not going to reverse our birth rate. We're not going to prevent all this misery and suffering. We're not going to reverse the situation in which people have to be essentially in apprenticeships until they're 40, as is the case in Europe, or perma students, or Rudyard had an interesting post about the 1400s, about how you had these kind of journeyman tracks, and then it was the point to where you could establish your own operation was getting later and later and later until people were in their 40s, and so they weren't able to have kids. So we need to break up this whole regulatory framework so that people can actually pursue their lives and have kids. But that creates all sorts of complications, like I said, with these older professionals who paid a lot for school and depend on a certain salary to pay off their debts. And the only way they can maintain that salary is to keep other people out of the industry. But hey, we need to disrupt these industries because we're going to die on the vine if not. So it's an interesting balance. Like, some people are going to have to take a hit, like, sorry, you got screwed over by school, but you can't keep the industry bottlenecked forever because you got a raw deal. Like, we need to free up doctors to help people learn skills, do surgeries, and not just in the model that the AMA says is appropriate. Oh yeah, I forgot. Let's play this clip.
You do see with the right and the left, there is this idea that the left embraces identity politics. This is what the Ben Shapiros of the world say. This is what the conservative establishment, Conservative Inc. says, that the left embraces identity. And I think there is part of the right which can be seen. I think that's why you get people like Mike Tokes and Ali Akbar who call me a leftist, because they say it's the same identity politics. But I think, to Richard's point about the fourth position, about this new identitarian place that we're entering, I do think we see an ideology of difference as opposed to sameness. I think what the right and the left have in common in their universalism is a rejection of difference in terms of gender, in terms of race. You know, we see both the right and the left embrace the idea that women and men are basically the same. You know, you'll have conservatives say that men and women are different, but are they really? Because they both encourage them to have the same exact functions in society. They both believe they should both be in the workforce, and feminism is okay in certain places, right? And on race, they both say we're all equal, we're all pink on the inside, both the right and the left. And so I think that kind of speaks to Richard's point and Alexander Dugin's essay, or his theory about the fourth political theory, which is we're moving into a new age where you have this global clash of civilizations, of all these different peoples coming together, coming into conflict, religions, ethnicities, nations, civilizations, where we're going to have to, I think, assert an identity very strongly. And I think it's grounded in race. I think it's grounded in biology. I think there's a cultural component as well, but I think that has got to be the answer to that from the right. I don't think it's going to be sufficient that we have kind of this milquetoast feminism, this milquetoast kind of racial egalitarianism. I don't think that's a sufficient answer for the left, because it's not rooted in reality. We know that in reality, things like gender, race, all the rest are firmly grounded in science. They're firmly grounded. You know, I was at American Renaissance, JF, you're a biologist. We know that scientifically these things are real. And so I think if we have that kind of, and I would describe myself with the adjective identitarian. I wouldn't say I'm like a noun and identitarian. I think we would have to, in some way, affirm that identity as real. So I think I'm in agreement there.
I mean, the easiest way to break this down is prison. If you have a zero-sum environment, then things can break down into pure race war. So that's, I mean, socialism does incentivize that. Socialism incentivizes that kind of a dichotomy, and the blank slate view, which he's attributing to the left, is insufficient. He's also attributing it to the right, but the left did blank slate, but the left also did the identitarian politics, where they were not just blank slating. They were talking about how identity is important, and these minorities are being robbed of their identity either through slavery or through forced assimilation. So the left was not just purely blank slating, and blank slating is not an adequate response. The left was kind of correct that identity is important, identity matters to people. And then what they don't get into is the biological science of it as much, which the right then over corrects on, because these it's the same thing people do with psychology, where they break politics. Like John Haidt has these different psychological profiles that are associated with libertarianism, liberalism, and conservatism. And people kind of confuse that for political values, because they're like, the psychological type that doesn't like being told what to do, that 10%, that's a 10% kind of fixed psychology. So then they think libertarians are a 10% fixed political group. But societies have changed drastically in terms of how libertarian they are over time with the same population and the same geography. 20 years ago, nobody knew even what the Fed was, pretty much. But 120 years ago, nobody trusted central banking. And today, they're distrustful of it again. So these things can shift drastically within a single population. And the psychological tendencies are just things that make it more likely you're going to be sympathetic to one ideology over another, but it doesn't mean that you can't satisfy your psychological profile through like there's an argument for every ideology, for every psychological profile. If you care about harm and fairness, then you might be more likely to be a leftist, but you could just as easily be a conservative or a libertarian if you associate those value structures with something that's going to reduce harm and increase fairness. For example, if deregulation gets rid of corporate power and empowers everyday person, empowers entrepreneur, and lowers prices and makes it so that you can start a bakery in your neighborhood, then that's contributing to alleviating harm, fairness, poverty. Then someone who cares about harm, fairness will legitimately latch on to that. And it's the same thing with racial groups, where there's tendencies similar to how there's the difference in psychological tendencies, and those tendencies are expressed, but they can all be interpreted through a framework. And then you have the other deeper layer where it's like, okay, you have the Celts and the Saxons, or the Germanic peoples in Europe, who have been basically fighting for thousands of years. And when you go into England and you see where the Celts and the Saxons line up politically, has been really consistent over time, where they fought each other in the Civil War, and then the immigrants from those groups fought each other in the Civil War in America. So Celt versus Saxon is still a well-defined political split. And so these cultural and genetic factors have huge impacts on a group basis that can be seen, but you still have the total ability for any one of those groups to adopt a totally alternate value set. Like even China has Taoism, which is an individual kind of philosophy. So like all these societies can go in these different ways, even though they have historical trajectories and genetic differences. So it's kind of in a position that's hard to describe, but it's a lack of absolutism about it, basically. Like people get way too genetically deterministic. And then they get cocky off of that basis. Like, if the US goes down a national socialist route and an African country copies Argentina, then they could begin having way more success than us in a non-ironic way. Like, the volatility of systems is so high in terms of potential results that you can't sleep on your values. It's not enough to just have all white people. It's you're going to run into serious problems regardless. So let's see what else we have.
Tucker's doing a great job. I'm the only one willing to say it directly without any caveats. And let's just be clear about that. Tucker's doing a great job. I salute him. Candace is doing an okay job. She's kind of going a little crazy, but, generally she's doing a good job. Dave Smith, Ian Carroll, a lot of these guys are doing a good job. But none of them are speaking directly and explicitly and wholly about the entire problem. I'm the only one that's giving you the whole message like this. Everybody else is saying, oh, it's the Israeli government. Oh, it's the Zionists. Oh, it's the neocons. Oh, but let's not talk about all Jews or whatever non sequitur. Let's not do blood guilt and become as bad as Mark Levin. I don't even know what that means and what that has to do with anything.
That's hilarious. This is exactly what I tried to warn people about, and what I pointed out with Tucker's getting on the bandwagon of basically the narrative of Israeli control of the U.S. government. Because Tucker knows that's not true. He's very well aware of the incentives of the empire and how we've operated consistently over a long period of time. And he's aware that we targeted former Soviet client states in the Middle East as soon as the Cold War ended. And our strategy was not identical to Israel's whatsoever. And Israel has had political changes according to our involvement in the region since they had to get on board with us. So there's a lot of stuff to go over there, basically. But the basic thing is, if you try and show you're so radical by blaming Israel for all these Middle East wars and kind of using it as a way to go after Ben Shapiro and Mark Levin, and also stay cool with Fuentes' audience, then it's not going to work. You can't play a half-assed version of his game. You have to go all the way or not all the way, because you're telling your audience that Israel is controlling U.S. foreign policy. But Israel is just a small country. So the only way to make that make sense is if you tie it into larger international systems, right? Which is where you get to Nick's victim consciousness around supposed Jewish supremacy and this whole narrative of like Zionism versus communism, which is completely absurd on its face, because we're talking about UN globalist international government versus whatever Israel does in Palestine. These are entirely different issues. And so then why are people upset with Tucker with his interview with Fuentes? And Tucker is saying, oh, well, I didn't do anything wrong because I actually challenged Nick. I challenged Nick on racism, but Nick never pretends, or he always claims that he's not racist. Nick's always talking about how you shouldn't hate people or be mean to people. This is just the situation. I'm just trying to describe the reality. And if somebody thinks that Jews control the world, then telling them to not be anti-Semitic is not going to be satisfactory, because they could be like, oh yeah, well, sure, I have no hate in my heart, but what are you going to do about the thing about the Jews controlling the world? Because that's still a problem, even if I'm not bigoted, right? That's the actual thing that Tucker has to take on. He has to take on the question of Jewish supremacy. This is what Jordan Peterson failed to completely address, and Tucker's failing in the opposite way by just trying to stay cool by talking about Israeli control or ignoring the other part. All you're doing is you're setting up your audience for a more complete explanation for Fuentes by saying Israel controls the US government. So you need to actually challenge the whole worldview, even if that makes it harder to stay cool or harder to beat Ben Shapiro and Mark Levin in a media war, in your opinion. In reality, I think it would make it easier to beat them in a media war, because you're not falling into this absurd dichotomy between Mark Levin and Fuentes. Like, nobody wants either of those things. The more popular position is not like being slavish over Israel or thinking that they control everything, because they really do not control our destiny, as Trump has demonstrated multiple times. It's just so it's funny. It's hilarious to see Nick make fun of that. Tucker's point about how we can't be anti-Semitic because then we're just as bad as Mark Levin and how he treats the Muslims. It's such a ridiculous side point. Like, nobody cares. None of this is about racism. It's about the Middle East wars, and it's about victim consciousness over theories of Jewish control, which are that is a huge problem because it's being used to basically split the right and advance global communism, which actually is a threat to everybody and the future of the world, unlike the Gaza situation, which is wrapping up with full, support of the Middle Eastern countries. I saw Nick also mention on another clip, it's like he's countering my exact narrative, which is strange, because he specifically mentioned like Turkey and Saudi Arabia don't like Israel, and how Israel could win, but only if they get rid of Iran, and then that locks in the Abraham Accords. But if they leave Iran around, they're not going to survive. It's all an absurd narrative because Iran is like the least popular country in the Arab world. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, countries that are allies of Israel and the US, pull much higher in popularity among the actual Middle Eastern countries than Iran. So the Middle East already decided that being an ally with the US or Israel is not a game changer. Like, Iran's popularity ticked up a few percents after October 7th relative to the other countries who were allied with Israel, but just a few percent. They're still at the very bottom of the barrel in approval. So Israel's going to be able to move on, and the Middle East is going to be able to move on without having to invade Iran. They've already kind of lost the cultural authority in the region. So it's funny to watch people's narratives kind of shift to the inevitable reality. But there's only so long you can kind of maintain this energy around the war with Iran continuing, which it's not continuing. There will be no war with Iran, so get over it, I guess. I think that's probably a good place to stop today. I had some more thoughts on one of his longer clips, but it's kind of too hard to find, and I don't. This is going to turn into the Nick Fuentes clip show pretty soon. So yeah, let me know if you have any thoughts on those topics in the comments. If anything I said wasn't clear, it's kind of hard to bring up the context and respond to it in my head. So maybe some more conversations would be interesting too. But all right, check out History 102, which is the other show, and Ludwig Never Mises on X, where I occasionally post. Other than that, have a good evening. Out.